So welcome back, everybody, and thanks for being with us for another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Raghuram Rajan with us and Rohit Lamba. They will talk about their new book, India's Untraveled Path to Prosperity, and that's a book. Welcome, both of you, for being with us.
Thanks, Markus.
It's great to have you. So that's the cover of the book, Breaking the Mold. And it will be mostly about the development in India. And we had some poll questions the authors put forward. So some of the poll questions, and I'll give you what you said. And thanks again for answering these poll questions. Do you think that India is the next China as an economic powerhouse? And the answers are 52% that yes, 48% that no. So it's split. The second question is India's current share of global trade currently larger in manufacturing or larger in services? And 14% that it's in manufacturing, and 86% thought it is in services right now. Okay. Following the East Asian manufacturing-driven growth path to achieve prosperity, is this the only proven way we have? Or is the window of opportunity, for this growth model, is it gone already? And people thought it's the only proven way, that's 32%. And the window is not open anymore, thought 68%. Spending $16 billion subsidies on the chip investment, is it smart or not for India? 48% thought it's smart and 52% it's not smart. So it's half-half almost. And can India become rich before it grows old? So until the dividend from the youth goes away, that's yes, India can do it. 65% that yes, and 35% that no. So it's 2/3, 1/3 almost. But most Indians or most audience members, they're very optimistic. So let me give you a very quick summary, some introductory remarks, and then we go into the author's presentation. So, of course, the growth strategies, the export-led growth strategy is, in contrast to import substitution, industrialization. That's what Latin America tried to do, and many other countries essentially failed doing it. So the export-led growth model worked, and it leads to a large foreign direct investments due to lower wages in emerging and developing economies. And you can scale up to the global market. But importantly, the advanced economy firms that compete with each other, and actually that gives some transfer away to the emerging economies. So don't internalize that, actually that gives some technological transfer for the whole industry away. So each firm is just racing to exploit the low wages, and this way they also give some IP and technology transfer in this way. And this way they educate the emerging markets workers. So at the end, there's a huge technological transfer, which is then beneficial for the emerging economies. The big question is, I think what the authors will answer, this works very well for goods, for manufacturing. Does it also work for services? Or for services, the same knowledge transfer, knowledge externalities among the firms passing on the knowledge, is this the same? And given that it works for goods, and then translates to services, can we leapfrog to service sector right away or not? So can we jump over the manufacturing part? Or is it a danger that, the service sector works more for well-educated population, but not so well for, not so well-educated people? And then the question is, part of the service sector is the financial sector, the technological sector. Of course, in India, you have a lot of regional savings investment imbalances. So some states save a lot, invest little, others invest much more. So the financial sector within India is also very important. And my final slide is essentially about India's role in the world. So India just has completed a very successful G20 presidency, I would say, in 2023. And the question is, will India become the leader of the global South? Will it take over the role from China? What influence will it have in Africa? As France steps out, will India step in? And what role will India play in the international financial system? And the subsequent question is a little bit, what role do the oligarchs play in India in the whole Indian development? So with these few words, I pass on the mic to Raghu, I think takes the lead with the slides, and then we have a debate or talk about this book, interesting book, as we go through the topics. Thanks again, Raghu.
Thanks, Markus, and thank you for having us here today. So why should you care about what we've written here? Well, India is a 1.4 billion people country. So it's big as China in population right now. And how it grows matters even intrinsically. But I think it matters for a variety of other reasons. One, it does matter if the old pathways for growth are more limited, as some of the questions seem to ask and some of your answers seem to suggest. Then what is the new pathway and how can you go along that? India may be the first to try it, and it may become a model for other countries, for example, in emerging Africa. So that's one reason. The second is if the idea is growth through manufacturing, is there really place for another 1.4 billion country to grow rich on that basis? And that means certainly, obviously substituting for existing manufacturers, but it also means cheapening manufacturing goods and adding to the mass of manufacturing consumption if this is going to be successful. And of course, that is going to have immense effects on the sustainability of the climate. Or is there another path which involves less about produced goods, maybe more for the domestic market than for exports, and more about exporting services as the lead sector? Again, this is not going to be the entire economy. It's going to be the lead sector for the economy as the economy grows. So with that in mind, let me get to the presentation. This is obviously joined with Rohit Lamba, who's also here. And what it helps to just tell this learned audience about is the traditional development route, the one popularized by East Asian countries, and it has been a very successful one. Start first with agricultural reforms, ensure that with the added incentives to produce, you see agricultural surpluses, which then start getting invested outside of agriculture, and typically in low-skilled manufacturing, typically assembly, but also garments, leather goods, and so on. And focus on exports, because exports provide the scale for the kind of production efficiencies that you want. And you typically are using your low-cost labor as a way to offset all the other disadvantages you have, the fact that you don't have, for example, good infrastructure, or your bureaucracy is overwhelming. But all these are offset to some extent with cheap labor. And that becomes the source of profits, which then allow you to reinvest in more capital goods to complement labor. And also you invest in human capital. Workers invest in themselves, the firms invest in the workers, and you get higher quality human capital over time. You go up the value chain. And also the government, with its higher tax revenues, invests in infrastructure, logistics, etc. So you go towards the frontier over time, scaling up in terms of sophistication. One example of this is China going from essentially assembly to producing state-of-the-art electric vehicles today. And then when you're sort of saturated on manufacturing, you start moving to services, which is where plenty of rich developed countries are. Now, China has followed this path, as I just said, but India hasn't. And the question is why? One reason that Yasheng Huang from MIT suggests is that China, when it liberalized, had much stronger education. Many more well-educated, high school educated sort of workers. That's really what you need for the even low-end manufacturing. You need to have some numeracy, some literacy. And also, he emphasizes the fact that these workers, after they got a little bit of savoir-faire in manufacturing, opened up their own units, and they knew enough to do the basic accounting and pricing and so on. And so you had the tremendous expansion of town and village enterprises, small shops run by small entrepreneurs, but expanding fast. So that was one difference between India and China. India never had that level of education, even when it liberalized 10 years later than China. So over time, it has improved, of course, but it didn't have at the time that China liberalized. Another aspect which Chiang Tai-shek, my colleague at Chicago, emphasizes is that even though both countries are really quite centralized, actually, effectively, China's much more decentralized. The municipalities have both power to determine things, but also the funding, and most important, the incentives. If you do well in promoting your township or your municipality, the party takes note of you and you get promoted for the growth you generate. So with the ability to formulate rules, essentially, local governments broke the rules for local enterprises in China and gave them all manner of support, including, for example, in Shanghai General Motors being the joint venture. The taxis you found in Shanghai were largely GM made because the local government supported its local champion. So what you had was what I call competitive cronyism, which is, yes, it was cronyistic between the government and business. It facilitated business, but it was competitive in the sense that municipalities competed with each other, and that allowed for certain amounts of efficiency. And of course, last thing, now India doesn't have this. India is much more centralized. And as Rohit keeps saying, the state of Uttar Pradesh has 240 million people, and it's all governed from Lucknow. So think of 2/3 of the United States being governed from one city. That's effectively what India has. Local government is much weaker in terms of powers, in terms of funds, and even in terms of people. China, the third thing, which some people would say is most important, I think it's one element of the package, is that it could suppress market and democratic forces. Market forces in the sense that even though they had strong productivity growth, wages didn't keep pace with productivity, allowing firms to generate more profits and reinvest them. The rates that were paid on savings were abysmal. And that allowed state banks to get cheap funding from households, and then they on-lent it to companies without marking it up too much. And as a result, companies got cheap funding, again, a big factor in their growth. And of course, factors like land, easily acquired by the state and given to companies to foster their growth, much harder, for example, to acquire land in India. So none of these was that easy in democratic India. You couldn't suppress unions. Unions would protest if you tried to do that. Land acquisition becomes a place where every entrepreneurial politician takes a stand to stop the government from acquiring more land to protect the people, poor people whose land is being acquired.
Can I ask one question? So concerning about this backyard competition across the different regions, but don't you have it a little bit in India too, that Modi essentially was in Gujarat, essentially very successful economically, and then was winning the elections at the national level? Would you say the Chinese model is better in having this competition across the provinces?
I mean, Modi got some credit for what he had done at the state level. It's hard to think of any other politician who has sort of moved up because of what they did on the business front. Modi kept emphasizing he'd bring the Gujarat model to Delhi. Now, it is possible that was an element in his popularity, but it is also possible that what was important at that time was in 2014, when he came to power, was people were pretty sick of the corruption that had taken place in the previous administration. And that became the big factor in the election. But, I'm not saying that elections and democracy doesn't have this indirect effect. The problem, however, in India is elections take place at the state level, and the states are already too big. Each state is the size of a France or a Germany, and that limits the amount of decentralization. India, of course, did better in services. Some of you noted that. It accounts for 5% of global trade in services, less than 2% in manufacturing. And it's not just, of course, service exports that it does. It does a lot of services domestically, one of the fastest growing jobs in India is that of security guard, which is a service. The share of employment in manufacturing, however, has been stagnant since the 1980s. And that is despite this government's emphasis that it wants to bring manufacturing back to India. Make in India is a big slogan for the current government. But if you look at the employment in manufacturing, it hasn't budged really. And it hasn't budged for the last 45 years. Services employment was expanding, absorbing some of the people leaving agriculture. But more recently, since 2019, it hasn't done so well as the economy has slowed in certain ways, which I'll talk about. One of the bright lights of this current government is the spending on infrastructure, which results in construction employment picking up. But the big question that people like Danny Roderick have asked is this premature deindustrialization? Is it a bad thing? And you can see it happening in Africa, in Latin America. Or is it potentially a reflection of India's comparative advantage in a changed world? And arguably, it's the latter, which we'll come to in a second.
So the one aspect of the figure is very interesting. The agricultural fraction went up. So that's a little bit perplexing.
Yes, it went up even before the pandemic. So the pandemic exacerbated it actually, but even before the pandemic, actually the numbers started going up.
Which is exactly this point, Marcus. This point is India has a problem, which is jobs. And India has relatively poor statistics on employment, unemployment. So you can have a vociferous debate between government economists and outsiders on whether India has an unemployment problem. Talk to anybody on the streets, India has an unemployment problem. And you can hear it in the interviews in the elections. The numbers are high, and disguised unemployment is even higher. Partly, you don't see some of it because labor force participation is low. People have sort of given up looking for jobs. Female labor force participation, alarmingly so. And the share of agricultural jobs, the point you noted, is increasing even before the pandemic. And that's suggestive we're not doing well on creating jobs. Enormous numbers of people applying for government jobs. The example I like to give is 1.2 million people applying for 6,000 jobs of low-level clerk in the state of Madhya Pradesh last year. Of this 1.2 million, we have 100,000 MBAs, 80,000 engineers, and 1,000 PhDs. So it says two things. One, there aren't very many private jobs, which is why so many people are applying for the government job, which is safe, even if it pays not very much. But also that many of these degrees aren't particularly sort of good degrees. And that's something we'll come back to later. Even as this is happening, the capital intensity of manufacturing is increasing. So this is a government which is supposed to focus on manufacturing. But if you look at the most capital intensive, the most labor intensive parts of manufacturing, such as garments, textiles, leather, those have actually shrunk since 2015. And that is a consequence of a sequence of blows that small and medium sector enterprises have faced. But those are job-creating places. And that's part of the reason we've seen such a problem with jobs. Now, why are jobs important? Because India is going into that sweet spot of demographic dividend, where many more people are entering the labor force than leaving it. The dependency ratio is falling. And what is important is you employ these people. Otherwise, if you don't employ them, you are wasting the demographic dividend. And so when people say India is growing at 6.5%, you want to ask the question, what did other emerging markets grow at when they had their demographic dividend? The easiest to compare with is China, because India was at China's per capita GDP around the early 2000s. China was growing at 12, 13, 14% at that point. So the worry is that India grows old before it grows rich at this pace of growth. It does definitely need to employ many more of its youth. So which way should India go now? One is turn back the clock to hop onto the low-skilled manufacturing bus, start again, essentially, with a more authoritarian government, with less democracy, and try and catch up. or figure out what makes sense for the future, given where we are and given where the world is, given the world has changed. And obviously, this determines how India uses its resources. We are not advocating industrial policy, pick a sector and then go all out in that sector. What we're saying is, understand what is open, what is available. That is normal strategic planning. And then go back and say, what do I need to do to ensure that we have the maximum opportunity across sectors? What is it that I need to invest in? And then let the flows happen. Let business decide where to go. You don't need to determine everything, but at least make sure we have enough resources for all the possibilities that exist. So why is the old path narrowing? Well, clearly there's a huge backlash against globalization, in part driven by the advent of China. Lots of talking about onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, pick-a-shoring, and add a word to it. And that's happening. A lot of it is not visible in the trade data because there is a lot of transshipment. You're shipping to Mexico, and then Mexico is shipping to the United States, but Chinese exports haven't fallen that much given the kinds of strictures that have been placed on it. But nevertheless, many countries now have reached the limits of how much they're going to see manufacturing fall. And it's unclear there will be room for another China. Now, I can hear people say, no, you're substituting for China, not adding to China. Well, there will be some additivity, and it's not clear there's that much room for that anyway. As important is that those initial profits made because you have low-cost labor, even if you don't have that great infrastructure or business environment, that's harder now because you're no longer competing with the US in manufacturing and assembly. You're competing with Indonesia, Mexico, Vietnam, China, and increasingly with robots as industrial countries bring the activity back. So it's far more competitive than it used to be, and it's unclear that you have profits, which is one reason why India has gone into subsidizing this stuff rather than trying to compete. We'll come to that in a second. So how should you pick if you were a management strategist advising the macroeconomy? One way to think about it is the smile curve, which represents a number of supply chains. This is something Richard Baldwin has talked a lot about. And in the smile curve, what you have is an initial part. So on the x-axis, we have the time sequence in the supply chain. And on the y-axis, you have value added. So think of an iPhone. The initial part of value added is heavily R&D intensive. It's Steve Jobs sitting with his best designers, putting together this iPhone. And in fact, so valuable is that part that the iPhone says designed in California. Now, who makes it? Foxconn makes it. Foxconn makes it in the US, not in the US, but in China, in Taiwan, and increasingly in India. And that's the lowest value-added part of the chain because it's so competitive. The assembly of components is not a big part of value-added. And finally, it goes back to all those fine Apple stores where it's sold. And then Apple gets the rents from the App Store, the iTunes, the content. So Apple takes both ends of the smile curve and is worth $3 trillion on a good day. Foxconn takes the manufacturing part and is worth $50 billion on a good day. Apple is worth 60 times as much, which reflects how much more value added there is in services than in low-level assembly, and also how embedded both are. Both are embedded in any new product. Now, some people say, well, you're talking about low-skilled assembly. What about one of the highest skilled manufacturing processes, that is chips? Well, TSMC is the iconic chip manufacturer. On a good day, it's worth $500 billion. It's enormously sophisticated manufacturing processes, undoubtedly, but it's worth $500 billion. NVIDIA was, when I last checked, before yesterday's spurt, was about $2.3 trillion. Qualcomm, Broadcom are $500 billion apiece. So again, even in something as sophisticated as chip manufacturing, a lot of the value is embedded in the services part. That's where the rents are.
But if I were to push you a little bit, but the number of people employed in manufacturing is probably much higher than in the design stage. If I want to employ millions of people, then I have to look at the numbers.
Let's come to that. We'll come to the manufacture, to the employment, because we are not saying that all these guys will be employed as chip designers. We're saying there is a leading sector which can be chip design, but you have to find employment elsewhere. We'll come to that. So why do we think that services need a closer look? India, amongst other countries, has a sense of manufacturing fetishism. This is the only way to grow. This is the only way to employ people. And, we'll come to the employment in a second. But what's changed is the delivery of services. A haircut used to be fixed in time and space. The traditional non-traded good, you couldn't sell haircuts to anybody across the world. And of course, you couldn't scale it up. You had to give one haircut at a time. Modern services are not so sort of tied. You can today target a foreign customer for a number of services, including yoga classes, for example. You can also obviously offer it to domestic markets. Direct services can be offered in real time, but they can also be embedded in products which then are delivered over time. Consulting, you do the consulting services in your own time. Finally, what is fixed in time and place is the presentation you offer the client. But you did that from your home in Chicago for your client in Seattle during the pandemic. Now firms are saying, why can't somebody sitting in Bangalore deliver it to somebody in Chicago? They just have to wake up at night to deliver it during office hours here. So the direct services are exploding, especially management-related services. But you also see services that are linked to manufacturing, embedded in manufacturing and in services. What we have is a new phenomenon called Global Capability Center, which is actually not a back office, but an office in India, which contains thousands of workers who are doing the kind of activity that then gets embedded in the products that you're selling across the world, whether they're service products or manufacturing products. So, for example, Goldman Sachs has its second biggest office in India, and those guys there are developing trading models. They're doing risk management models. They're even doing some trading themselves. So it is really another office, but focused on certain aspects that are then embedded in products. But you have Victoria's Secrets, you have Rolls-Royce. All of these have their global capability centers in India. India accounts for about 40% of the global number of these centers. And you have, people like JP Morgan employing 3,000 lawyers in India, writing contracts for their business across the world. So these are lawyers who are not doing Indian law, they're doing US law sitting in India. And of course, you have a bunch of new companies which are not just embedding in manufacturing. And by the way, software is embedded in manufacturing. 40 million lines of code embedded in Tesla. That's another example of a finished product which has a lot of embedded services. But there are also firms enabling manufacturing. Here are three examples. I'll go quickly, and we'll end soon to give time for discussion. Tilfi is a sari manufacturer. Basically, gets saris made by people who have learned how to weave saris, traditional handicrafts. These are silk saris, very fine, take a long time to weave. Big problem before Tilfi was that nobody knew they were genuine. And in a sense, the only way the artisan could establish they were genuine was by sticking to traditional designs. And of course, that also helped them manage risk because they owned the product regardless of whether they could sell it or not. What Tilfi said was, we're going to take the sari from you once you start making it. And the risk of selling or not selling is ours. That allowed them to bring new designs, which the crafts men embraced. And now Tilfi is selling these saris across the world through its website, a lot to the diaspora, but also in India. That's an example of services enhancing manufacturing. The manufacturing is a traditional one, but it's exploding. On the right, top right, is a rocket manufacturer in Chennai who operates out of an office there. How does one manufacture rockets in India where manufacturing is a little more difficult? They don't. They 3D print their rockets and then put them together. And that allows for much more flexibility in design, which is the advantage that Agnikul has. One side of the office is all these young 20, 30-some kids with their laptops designing furiously these rockets. They can customize the rocket to the customer, and they can send these 20, 25 feet rockets into space at a fast clip. So again, they've adapted to the Indian environment. And the third entity here at the bottom is Orchids, the international school. This is a school which starts with the idea, how do I multiply education manyfold, good education manyfold? How do I create an Andover or an Exeter? Well, I can't, because those schools have tremendously long traditions and they've spectacular faculty. But how do I make sure that we have very good schools and catering to a large number of students? And what these guys have done is essentially scripted 30,000 lessons. First 10 minutes, you show this video. Next 10 minutes, you have this discussion. Here are the points that you should make and make sure the class arrives at that. You know, it's the kind of teaching I would be unable to do. But what it does is it makes a moderate teacher into a very good teacher, because they stick to the syllabus, they know what they teach, and in fact, a lot of it is pre-programmed for them, so they really have to facilitate the class rather than actually teach the class. And Orchids now teaches 65,000 students, that is 65 Andovers and Exeters, probably not at that same level, but at a pretty high level. And it also sells its lessons to another 350,000 students. So this is an example of new kinds of thinking. Michael Kramer and his co-authors suggest that scripted learning actually makes a huge difference in the learning that students get, because
this example is mostly for export, or is it mostly for the domestic market?
It's domestic. This is entirely domestic. This is domestic.
So the printing happens of the rockets happens, the 3D printing happens in India as well.
It's in India. It's actually one side of the office.
Campus.
One side of the office is printing the rockets, and the other side is these kids working on the laptops. So this is a question that, are we advocating industrial policy? Let's now go into services rather than manufacturing. And the reality is India does not do industrial policy well. We have many failures, which the rest of the world should learn from. Maybe the rest of the world can do it better, but we don't. So we're not saying manufacturing or services, but we're saying let's upgrade human capital and not put all our weight on just physical capital. Let us also, in some sense, one of the key reforms we suggest in the book, and of course the book is far more detailed than I'm talking about here, is decentralized government, not just to benefit in the way China did from better rule making, but also in spreading education and healthcare at much better quality than we have today. And you see again and again, it's the decentralized governments which have to respond to the local citizenry, which seem to do a better job in India in providing these human capital enhancements. And we're also saying that, stop wasting money. You said 16 billion, my count is 10 billion for chips, and $10 billion for chip foundries. India doesn't need them. Let the rest of the world go there, but spend that 10 billion in improving the quality of universities. Get 10 more, 15, 20 more top universities, and you will have plenty of chip designers who, instead of chip manufacturers. As I said, India already has 300,000 of them. And basically foster innovation and creativity to capture the high value added. Of course, every other country is trying to do this, but you have a lot of people. If you can educate more people well, you have a chance of doing that.
Can you come back to the human capital? So what type of human capital is it elementary education or is it like advanced
degrees? Every level, unfortunately, Markus. It's every level. So India has, so where are the students coming for these GCCs? They're from the top universities that you have seen, the Indian School of Business, the Indian Institutes of Management, the Indian Institutes of Technology. But they're the tip of the iceberg. India produces 1.5 million engineers a year. And, a lot of them don't have very good training. So some of what India needs to do is upgrade that last mile, bring them up to speed, for example, on machine learning, on AI. That's something the software companies used to do very well. Take in a lot of people, put them through a six-month course, and make them into fantastic programmers. So we can do a lot of that.
But on the Infosys of India doing this already to bring their own people up?
They are. But what I'm saying is that's one method of bringing people up to speed, and we can do far more of that, especially going below the top tier colleges. But we also need innovation, which means we need top universities, Xinhuas of the world. How do we do that? We need to seed new universities, and that's why I'm saying spend the 10 billion on new universities, and bring back a lot of diaspora to seed these universities along with top Indian academics. You're going to get a lot better institutions if you do that. And of course, you need stronger business university links, a lot more research. Again, this is something that China has achieved in the last 15, 20 years, the tremendous expansion.
Markus, and you would argue that this would trickle down to the less educated people too. Because the issue is you have a lot of not so well educated people who really need manufacturing as an easy entry point.
Of course. So what we're saying is every stage needs work. So, the ASA report says 75% of kids in third grade can't read at second grade level. So we need to improve the quality of our primary schools. Before that, we need to improve the quality of childcare. So we need investment across the board. The good news is India doesn't invest too much in it. So any additional investment can make a big difference. But we also need to incentivize politicians to emphasize this, which is why we keep saying more decentralization would be a good thing. And every finance commission, which apportions funds within the center and the state, used to push for more decentralization to the third level. During this government, it has reversed. And we need to change that back again to push for many more lower level functionaries and functions being exercised, which will be about creating that first level of human capital, which is so important. So what about Indian democracy, bug or feature? And we think it's a feature right now. It may have been a bug earlier, right? India in development time democratized too early. It democratized when it was very poor. Even the US and the United Kingdom didn't really embrace democracy until they were much richer. But really, at this stage, when we're trying a new path, it's going to be really important because it tells us when we're off track. It allows bottom-up protest when you're not getting good public services. Remember, we need better education, better healthcare. You need the people to be able to protest at their local authorities and say, why is the teacher not showing up? Why is the pharmacy not open? Why doesn't it have medicines? But also, as Markus, creativity and innovation requires free thinking. And studies show again and again that democracy is really very important for that. Your right to protest also gives you the right to challenge the establishment in science, or the right to challenge the establishment in arts and creativity. So that, I think, is also important. And you can see the consequences of more authoritarianism in China, where the government has shifted over time, and a lot of Chinese academics worry that this is going to inhibit China's longer run development because it inhibits creativity. And finally, trust. I mean, think of selling of TikTok or Huawei. They have problems selling in the US because nobody trusts that the government will not invade the data that these companies gather about US citizens. And I think if India stayed democratic, it would be a very important support to services exports, because services can be very data intensive. This is your question, Markus. Will this create enough jobs? Well, we're talking about a whole of country effort. The leading edge is that skilled services exports. But you need a lot more education, a lot more healthcare. That's going to expand jobs in healthcare, education, childcare, all of that. I mean, just as a simple example, we have 1.23 million creches. If we had one half part-time worker in each creche looking to teach the kids there, that would be 1.2 million jobs. Now, of course, you need to find a way to pay for it, but it is a job which will add to the investment in human capital. But more investment in childcare, education, healthcare will entail job creation. In India, it is a reality that people don't buy from restaurants or get their clothes done in the laundry. They hire a cook. They hire a maid to run the laundry at home. And so every high-end job creates 4 others in India today. That will change as these services become more arm's length, but it does create the possibilities of consumption. And of course, many more jobs, if you take development seriously of this kind. Local government has to be strengthened. Cities have to be upgraded and public services enhanced. There's rural and agri-based industry which can expand. What we're saying is there are many possibilities. But let's not pick one. Let's instead fix the basics. Even manufacturing may expand, not so much by fixing India's deficiencies, not so much by subsidies, but by fixing India's deficiencies. Here's an example of somebody who's done it all. This is a guy who's very successful, 30, 40 something, runs a company called ID Foods, sells food across India. He's a farm laborer's son. His father picked ginger, threw it on a truck, paid very low wages. Mustafa, like all Indian kids, entered school and like many kids struggled. He failed in 6th grade. And it was only the luck he had. A teacher came to his farm and said, hey, come back. You're wasting your life if you do this. Got Mustafa back into school. Mustafa started doing well, became an engineer, then came back to do his MBA, then started a firm. And the firm does something as simple as making idli batter, which is the basis for the rice cakes, idli, that some of you must have eaten. And he does it in a very hygienic way with cameras installed in his factory, with a product which he's tested for a long time to get just the right mix, which stays fresh. He focuses on the packaging. This is something very different from those plastic packages put together by hand in stores. You're not sure of the hygiene, etc. And he finds a ready market in New India, housewives wanting to buy this because they don't have the grind of actually doing it themselves, and they can make the idli and then claim full credit for every aspect of the production process there. So Mustafa,
service of manufacturing almost. No,
what's that? It's both. Yeah, it's both. It's both. He has, as I said, cameras installed real time. You can look at the real time feed and see the cleanliness of the factory. And that's a way of convincing people. Branched off into coffee and so on. 2,500 workers selling in the Middle East today. This is a success story which I think reflects the change that can come through education. Rags to riches in one generation. This is possible if, of course, this is a selected example. But we need many more of this. When I was at the RBI, we used to have a party at the end of the year for the class 4 employees. And these are people at the bottom of the totem pole as far as the Reserve Bank goes, the drivers, the peons, the cleaners. And their children were amazingly managers of banks, workers at Infosys. They had transcended from lower middle class to upper middle class in one generation because their parents were in a city, could afford to send them to reasonable schools, and that was what made the magic. So This is our proposal that even if manufacturing is narrowing, there's a lot else that can chart the way to growth. India also has a large domestic market, which can be part of the answer. Services doesn't need that much scale, but don't fixate on services. Fixate on the fundamentals that will allow both manufacturing as well as services. And Indian business will figure it out. And that can, as they figure it out, offer a new pathway to growth. So that's Rohit, you may have some additional comments.
Just very quick, because I think, Markus, before we had, I think because and a lot of the audience may be academic or academically inclined, even though the book is about India per se, there is a conceptual point that Raghu and I think economists will and are probably arguably already are starting to think about systematically, is that, if you think of the classic Lewis paper, which is the foundation of the structural transformation literature, he basically talks about a two-sector model. And the other sector having kind of unlimited labor supply, right? In the world, which is going to see greater levels of automation, and where the so-called China shock has driven down rents from low-skill manufacturing to be so low, how are the countries that are going to have demographic dividends in the 21st century, a large number of them being in Africa, are going to grow? And I think what we think is that if you take our argument seriously, there is a systematic way economists can think about post Danny Roderick's deindustrialization. How do we think about structural transformation given this narrative that we are putting forward, in which India would just be one example?
So I have a few more questions also from the audience, and thanks to the audience for all these questions. One is, I know that you don't make this sharp distinction between manufacturing versus services, but let me just raise some questions along this line. So one issue is that, in manufacturing, there's much more coming up with robots, and there might be a threat. We don't need so many workers anymore because robots will take over, and you can essentially reshore back to the United States or to Europe. But where's the threat bigger? Is it in the manufacturing, I have the robots threat, but in the service sector, I have the AI threat. So where do I see a lot of services will be done by artificial intelligence? And one could make the case that in the service sector, the artificial intelligence will have a much bigger impact than in the physical world where the robots are active. Do you have a take on this? AI on the service sector versus robots on the physical manufacturing sector?
Let me take a first shot. We don't know. We don't know. And that's why we're so hesitant about saying industrial policy. Pick the sector, and I think what you do is take a bet that more creative work is going to be enhanced by AI rather than completely substituted by AI. Of course, there will be some displacement, but there will be some enhancement also. And of course, there'll be new jobs that come which are possible because of AI. You're well aware, Markus, that many of us have started using large language models in trying to help our research. We'd have to have thousands of RAs in the past to do that kind of work. Today, we can use the LLM. So there will be all three. And my sense is nobody really knows where it's going to. I mean, if you think about what Elon Musk is saying, he's saying using AI in cars to enable this driverless car is going to be so huge. He wants to put all his eggs in that basket. So he's thinking of machines becoming more clever. And of course, what is a driverless car except a robot? And so you can imagine far more robots in firms. But I think all said and done, I still want to put more weight on skilling and creativity and education, because whatever survives may be easier there. Now, you may tell me that cooks will still persist and so will gardeners. And absolutely, we're not saying we shouldn't have those jobs. And that's why broadly we're saying at every level we need to enhance capabilities so that the cook can read the recipes and create new ones. But we need a whole of country effort, and that's the only way to deal with some of these challenges.
Just in a more
related to
econ
the
language, Markus, just just to give the listeners an evocative example, right? Some of them may remember a floppy drive, like where memory was so expensive, right? And so when memory became cheap, some jobs went away as the bank tellers and so on. But what it did was when the marginal cost of something goes down, actually its ability to adapt to various other tasks goes significantly up, right? So all of this Uber, Airbnb, all of these firms have been able to create because the price of memory almost dropped to zero. So we don't know what other sorts of jobs and tasks may be created once the price of computation and language models becomes so low.
Let me try another way. So essentially, you make an argument we should invest much more in human capital and less in physical capital, if I make it black and white. Of course, as an academic, I like this thought, but let me make, just for the sake of argument, where do you think is the higher uncertainty? It could be that if you invest in human capital, things will be outdated. And if you listen to Harari and others saying, okay, we don't really know what we need in terms of human capital in 5 years or 10 years. We never have lived in such a drastic change and so high uncertainty on human capital side. While in the physical capital, I guess it might be less uncertain. So I just throw this at you. Perhaps you can.
Well, I saw you being hesitant on that second statement, Markus. We don't know. Physical capital, obviously right now we're all worried about green, and therefore, is any of the gas guzzling stuff that we're buying and putting into into use going to be going to have a life? Is it going to become a stranded asset? But to your point, it's a very important question, right? And I think that again and again emphasizes the flexibility of learning is more important than the actual learning. You have to teach your students how to learn rather than so much what to learn. And I think that's becoming more and more true today, right? So I'm an old dog, right? How do you teach the old dog new tricks? Well, you don't. You find a co-author who knows those new tricks, and then But what you know is you need to know enough to understand what you're asking the co-author, and the co-author then you can comprehend the answers. So my sense is we need to build in flexibility in education, which is why even though ORCIDS is scripted, I think it keeps asking students to use their mind. It's not rote learning. It's sort of opening up learning. I mean, they have pianos in their schools to teach kids some of the arts and so on. I think we need much more of that, and that's why we need to focus on improvements in education, improvements in human capital building. But I agree with you absolutely. It's not a package that you convey to them and expect that's going to serve them for the rest of their lives.
So 2 quick points, Markus. One is that, these things usually, despite the enthusiasm that academics have, these things usually take longer than we think. So, I remember when I was in grad school and taking your classes, and, there was this thing that, one of the largest employers of unskilled labor in America is the job of a truck driver. Even already in the 2010s and 11s, there was this feeling that this job was going to go away. It hasn't. It's been 10 years, right? And the second point is specific to India, is that according to Parliament data, 700,000 Indian students young Indians just left last year to go abroad for higher education. If you make a conservative estimate that each of them took $10,000 with them, we're talking about $7 billion, which is almost equivalent to India's entire higher education budget of the central government. So if you're thinking about import substitution, this is the right way of import substitution with large positive externalities.
So that leads to the question actually Martin Mühleisen threw into the Q&A box, which is the time scale. Is, this human capital investment might be much slower than a physical capital investment. What's your case that, that the human capital, it might not happen quickly enough relative to a physical capital investment, which can scale up much more quickly? Or is this?
Well, it depends, right? There are sort of low-hanging fruit. So, for example, if you do that last mile training for these kids who, 50% of Indian graduates are unemployable, according to a survey company, Weebox. How much would it take to make many of them employable? Can you have good last mile programs like the ones that Infosys TCS and so on had, but in other areas. For example, the Congress Party has in its manifesto apprenticeship programs for all graduates. Now, I think that's an ambitious scheme, but if you can deliver some of that well, a lot of the youth who are coming out can become more employable. So that's short run. I talked about ready-made jobs, which you can employ people in. That's also short run. Of course, that requires a lot more spending, which we need to find room for. But then there are medium-term things. A lot of kids now, everybody wants a white-collar job. Can you move them more towards vocational institutions? Can you bring the vocational institutions to talk more to the manufacturers to figure out exactly what skills they need? That is something that can be done in 2 or 3 years, right? It doesn't require an aeon. To build an Oxford or a Harvard will take 20, 25 years, right? But I think you have pretty good institutions that can be upgraded. The Indian Institute of Science is a venerable institution, focuses on research. And seeding it with a few more resources, a few more people from outside, have a few new departments, and hey presto, you get something which looks a lot more like Xinhua than it looks right now. So my sense is you need to take both the short term and the medium term and the long term view on every aspect here. And take the flip side. If India wanted to manufacture chips, how long does it take to get to the level of TSMC? It takes a good 20, 30 years. It's not something, what you can do in a few years is get 4th or 5th old generation chips. 28 nanometers is what we're going to produce now. State of the art is 2 and 3. So we're still a long way from doing state of the art chips.
But the good news, in some sense, to Martin's question, is that India is, and we emphasize in the book, India is actually getting a lot of the physical infrastructure right in the last decade or so, getting ports made at a higher speed, railways, highways, and so on. And I think what the hypothesis that we are kind of putting forth is that the binding constraint, in some sense, was more likely turn out to be the human capital than the physical capital, given the speed at which we're already trying to solve various logistical problems.
Mm-hmm. The other thing is when I think about services versus manufacturing, the law enforcement. So if we thought a lot about human capital investment and all that, but you also need property rights and clear law enforcement, so intellectual property rights and all this. Do you emphasize this equally? This is equally important to human capital, or what's your take on that? And is India ready for that to develop essentially the legal framework and enforce the legal framework where the court rulings and everything happens on time to get this speeded up? Because it's equally important, I would say. Human capital is important, but also, if you want to invest in some new technologies, you have to protect it somehow too and have a modern intellectual property rights regime.
Rohit, you want to take a...
So we talk about this in the book actually at length. And so, let me give you an example, right, by answer. So do you think firms of the future will be more comfortable interacting with Indian law, or let's say customers sitting in the US or Europe will be more comfortable knowing that their medical and financial records are going to China, Russia, or India? Right. So, and we're already seeing elements of this with TikTok and Huawei, right? So we're actually emphasizing that given the composition of growth that is likely to be in the future, India is actually placed well if it doubles down on its democracy and rule of law, as you're rightly suggesting. We're saying that India actually has a higher head start than some of its competitors, and the role actually and the goal actually should be to strengthen some of these intellectual property law, these privacy laws, and play to India's strengths. Especially in the context of what you're suggesting.
But Markus, this also means that we do have to invest in the sort of legal infrastructure, for example. So what the government has done recently is made patent filing easier by having a lot more patent examiners. But we have to make sure the quality doesn't get diluted, and bring a lot of technological aids to the help of these people so that they can maintain high quality. But we also need many more judges, as you correctly point out. Indian justice takes a long time. But that's a job we can create. If we can improve the number of judges, speed judgments, that'll be a huge benefit to India. So, I think if we are clever, there are lots of jobs we can fill which will enable growth. Let me give you one example. This comes from Abhijit Banerjee, which is India has a lot of quote unquote barefoot doctors. These are guys who spent their lives in the pharmacy or in a dispensary, or maybe even just writing down what the doctor said. They hovered around the doctor. They understand some of the rudiments of medicine, and they've set up as doctors themselves. And they are now diagnosing and prescribing for ordinary patients. And of course, one of the problems is they may not be very sound on all the basics. So Abhijit says, why don't we, instead of eliminating them, which is what the Indian Medical Association wants, instead train them up to recognize the top 20 diseases and be able to prescribe appropriately, and let them also know what they don't know, and then push those cases up into the knowledgeable part of the system. So, I mean, these are ways of restructuring that can aid tremendously to well-being as well as growth, because it makes these guys actually now more trusted, because they have a certificate saying they've passed that exam which you gave, which checked their basic qualifications. So I think just India needs to be more creative about it.
So let me come back to one point, and then we have to come to the end pretty soon, which Rohit mentioned, is geopolitical dividend. So is it correct that you give the impression that the geopolitical dividend is more, India has a bigger advantage because it has a better rule of law, or at least hopes to have a better rule of law compared to China and others, rather than the physical trade advantages when there are import tariffs imposed on Chinese products? How would you value these two advantages India has from a geopolitical side at the moment?
I mean, I think India has to be competitive. There's no alternative. It has to be competitive. Otherwise, we will find ways to arbitrage even the geopolitical threats. But if it is competitive and there is a geopolitical advantage, which is not, we can't take for given. We have to make sure India stays well and truly in the camp of the democracies, that checks and balances are maintained, it doesn't turn authoritarian. All those are important factors to be considered by India over time. But I think absolutely, if we can add the democratic advantage to the fact that there is no efficiency discount you have to expect when you buy Indian, I think we have a much better chance of succeeding than without the democracy advantage.
And Markus, there's some very pure econ principles at play here, right? Like, so the global capability centers that Raghu was talking about, right? Why are they doing so well? Is that basically if your student at Princeton wants to have a job at Google or Goldman Sachs, you probably have to pay them $200,000. That person can do about 80% of the job in Bangalore at $50,000. So the labor arbitrage is just massive. And we think it will continue to grow. Just think of how clogged the National Health Service in Britain is. And so and given how old the West is growing, it is going to be inevitable, if India plays its cards right, that you will see a rise in globalization of services just purely on simple econ principles. And India is well placed to take advantage of that, given all the things that Raghu is saying.
So the final question, let me go a little bit beyond India. I mean, there are other countries which have a huge demographic dividend coming up, and perhaps even longer lasting, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa. Would you say, given your analysis, the African nations should also consider leapfrogging the manufacturing stage, go to service stage, for emphasize much more human capital and development? Would you go so far? Or would you say there are certain things they should do differently from India? Is there any lessons beyond India from this book?
Rohit?
Yeah, so I was trying to emphasize that I think there is a lot of interest in this. I mean, I don't think we have something very scholarly yet to say on that, but I do think this is a question that is going to come up and more in the next few decades, as you say, as other countries experience the demographic dividend. I do think that what we are offering is a plausible model, almost a first model for a country of India's size, to actually, quote unquote, skip the standard structural transformation route and develop comparative advantages in different kinds of services, right? So it could be services that are tradable with the rest of the world, or it could be services that you kind of focus more towards your domestic markets. So it's going to be, I mean, you know, I don't have a general prescriptive pill, but it is true. It is almost inevitable, actually. It's inevitably true, almost by design, that some of these countries will have to focus much more on various kinds of services than low-skill manufacturing. And hence the notion of what is the correct structural transformation route, which is kind of embedded in our heads from 20th century, may start to being updated.
You know, I want to sort of add to that by saying, you know, two aspects are different from what they used to be. I think one, of course, is the tradability of services, which has been enhanced considerably. The other, I would argue, is that we are slowly, not as fast as we would like, but slowly understanding how to do education better. And that transformation of human capital, I think, is as important as the tradability of services. If you add both those things together, they offer a new path for growth, which I think is sort of the lesson we're trying to offer. I mean, again, your question about how long this would take is important. But, you know, before you know it, decades are gone. And it's important to start because you can make a lot of difference in a decade or two in certainly on enhancing human capital. And I think this is a lesson for much of Africa. If they can, it doesn't require a huge amount of resources, at least at the lower levels, and at the upper levels, there are ways to pay for it. But I think it's important that countries think about it.
So let me nevertheless throw in a last question. So now there's a lot of, you know, tariffs are imposed on manufacturing goods at the moment, and we see actually the whole, you know, globalization going backwards to some extent, and the good side. But I can imagine that, you know, if there's a lot of service picking up and there's a lot of experts in the service sector, there will be tariffs on services as well. And there will be hindrances. Particularly, it's much easier to do. Just change the law that, you know, certain requirements, some standardization and things like that. Would you argue that your path for India works even if India is cut off from, let's say, the United States or Europe in terms of doing exports on the service sector? Or does it rely that you can actually provide an export to the United States?
Well, I think eventually India will become a large enough market. And one of the things we emphasize in the book is scale is not as important for services as it is for manufacturing. But that said, I think the export-led services model is attractive. But it's important to understand that the biggest exporter of services in the world is not India, it's the United States.
US.
So once you start putting all these barriers, many can play at that game. And so I think it was much more skewed as far as manufacturing went. It's less skewed as far as services go. Services are often the place where, you know, take medical services. It takes me 3 months to get an appointment in the US to see a doctor. There are shortages. Of course, it's highly defended, this area. The rents are high, and you know, doctors in Massachusetts can't necessarily operate in another state in the US. But this is sort of the last frontier. So one reason is self-interest. You don't put too many barriers when you yourself are selling financial services, consulting, legal services across the world. A second, I would argue, is it's harder sometimes. I can understand there are ways to stop services, but it's harder to stop them when they're virtual. You know, even with goods, you send them to Mexico for final finishing, and then they go to the US, and it's harder to understand which ones are really made elsewhere. The domestic or content is hard to determine. With services, it's going to be even harder. How does anybody tell whether you actually got everything in the presentation done elsewhere, and then you came in, delivered the presentation? You have to track the flows of cash, and then, you know, cash is fungible, so you have to have basically the FBI on every cash transfer to ensure that there is no. So I think virtual services are going to be harder to stop at the border than manufacturing.
So thanks a lot. Typically, we end at a positive note. I think are you both positive that India will grow and reach the path to prosperity, or some positive note at the end? And then
Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, I think that India is I mean, just even if all the things that we're, India doesn't, that we are presenting in the book, India doesn't get some of that right, the general trajectory of India is positive. It's growing at 6% per annum. That's probably its growth potential. I think what we are saying is we're being, very greedy for our countrymen and saying that, which is the question we started with, can India become rich before it becomes old? And I think to be able to put all Indians with decent standards of living and with decent jobs, a lot more needs to be done. But overall, yes, I think we're both very optimistic about India, and the book is actually very optimistic.
And to some extent, the book is written with a lot of examples because we want to attract a larger audience. And we think there is receptivity, not just in India, but outside, to reading this message. This is a book which is not merely for economists, not even written for economists, but written for a much wider audience with underlying economic principles that are worth considering. So hopefully we get that audience. Let's see.
Very good. Thanks a lot to both of you, and also thanks to the whole audience. And I see you again soon, and see you around. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Markus.
And
Thanks.
Bendheim Center for having us.